kind of seems obvious that consciousness is there to enable us to do intelligent, adaptive behavior. But for a couple of decades now, there's a string of results that have been coming out of neuroscience and psychology that show us that consciousness is much less involved in controlling behavior than we previously thought. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the central role of consciousness in guiding behavior has been dethroned. So what should we conclude from this? Is it that consciousness is just some kind of surveying mechanism, watching what's going on, but not controlling it? Or does consciousness have a role? And if it does have a role, what's it good for? What are the things that it's useful for doing? And what are the things that are better left to our unconscious systems? And I think that informs quite a practical question that we come across in our everyday lives or in setting up organizations and structures. The question is, in what circumstances should we be using our conscious reasoning, and in what circumstances should we trust unconscious or automatic processes? Now, you might decide beforehand how you're going to play when you're facing Andy Murray, but after his serve has left the racket, you don't have time to be conscious of what the ball's doing before you have to react. And neuroscience has now got quite a good handle on how long it takes for the brain to build up the kind of activity that's required for consciousness, and it takes hundreds of milliseconds. So the people facing professional tennis players' serves, they're reacting in intelligent, adaptive ways, but that doesn't depend on their consciousness at all. And there's much more everyday examples of this. So think of what happens when you see a snake and you become frightened. This has been studied by neuroscientist Joe Ledoux and his colleagues, and he's shown that there's an automatic non-conscious response to fear stimuli that doesn't go via the bit of the brain that's responsible, or at least centrally involved in consciousness, the cortex, that goes directly to behavior. So there's a very fast route, he calls it the low road, between a fearful stimulus and an automatic response of increasing your heart rate, breathing more quickly, releasing adrenaline, a fight or flight response. And all of that happens before consciousness has ever got involved. But I think it goes deeper than that. There are cases when consciousness gets in the way. So there was a study performed on expert golfers, and they were interested in the way that consciousness interacts with play. So what they got the golfers to do was to listen to something in headphones where they had to listen out for an unusual tone. So they're performing a task in their headphones. And at the same time, they had to play quite a difficult shot. And they contrasted that with a case where the golfer didn't have to do a task in the headphones, but just had to concentrate consciously on the elements of their shot. For expert golfers, they were better at performing the shot when they had to do this other task in parallel. They were worse at the shot if they consciously thought about what they're doing. And I think all of us can think of examples in everyday life that are like that. So it's not just that unconscious processes can sometimes help get things right, it's that consciousness can sometimes get in the way of adaptive, intelligent behavior. So in this project, we wanted to study that in a very simple, very pared-down paradigm. But I'd like to give you a kind of sense of what it's like to generate the data that's behind this finding that consciousness is being slightly dethroned. So what we did is present subjects with a very simple task. I'd like you to try it out in a kind of simple way today. The task is that you're going to see a cross on one side of the screen or the other. And the task is just to, if you're a subject, is to press a button that corresponds with the side of the cross. Now, this little arrow comes up before you see the cross. It's giving you some useful information. It's pointing in the direction that the cross is likely to be on. So in this case, you know the cross is likely to be on the left-hand side. You'll likely have to push your left-hand finger. We make it slightly more complicated because in the cases we're interested in, the unconscious cases, that arrow is presented for a very, very brief period and then covered by this pattern, a pattern mask. And the effect of the pattern mask is that subjects aren't consciously aware of the direction of the arrow. And we know that because we can test them. We can give them a forced choice and say, which way was the arrow pointing, left or right? And they're a chance as to which way it's pointing. So consciousness hasn't registered the direction of the arrow. Nevertheless, we wanted to see whether the unconscious information in the arrow was having an effect on pressing left or pressing right. Now, you won't be able to get exactly this because you're not sitting in controlled situation in front of a monitor, but I wanted to give you a sense of it. So I'll give you a little video now. What you'll see is a fixation cross in the center of the screen, and then the task will be to press left or press right, depending on whether the cross shows up on the left or the right. And you'll see the arrows showing up in the middle. And on the first two occasions, you should be able to consciously see the arrow. The second two occasions will be very fast, and I think for many of you, you won't consciously see it. So let's just have the video now. Have a go at pressing your finger on the left or the right side. Can we go over to the video?
That was very fast. I didn't see it.
Right. Okay, we're back to the slides. So I hope from many of you, you could certainly see the contrast between the first cases where the arrow was conscious, and the second case where the arrow is very, very fast. And in controlled conditions, we can make it so fast that you're not conscious of it. Probably for many of you weren't. Now, what you won't have been able to see is that that makes a difference to how fast you were pressing your finger in response to the crosses. But we can collect that data across lots of subjects, and it's a very subtle effect. So this is in milliseconds. But what you have on the left there is how fast subjects respond when the arrow is pointing in the right direction. It's pointing in the direction the cross comes up. And on the right is what happens when the arrow is misleading. It's pointing in the wrong direction. You can see there's a very slight difference. Subjects are slightly faster. It's interesting for us because here's a cue that subjects are completely not conscious of, and nevertheless it's helping them perform the task. It's aiding their behavior. And that's a statistically significant, robust effect. So here it looks like consciousness might just be playing a helping role. So this is something I got into conversation with Barry about. You were pressing me about this earlier.
I think when you're conscious of it, you were telling us that consciousness takes up time. So it should slow you down, so it should be interfering. And here what we've got is the very simple case when it's unconscious that we're actually speeded up. Are we also speeded up when we're doing it consciously and we get a cue to go left or right?
So it also speeds you up in the conscious case, and so we've got a kind of lining up between what consciousness does for you. It can speed you up, but it can also work unconsciously. But an interesting contrast is that you might think, well, unconscious processing can just help. But an interesting contrast is cases where the unconscious processing does better than the conscious one. And I told you about the golfing case, but I want to show you another case that's been studied that's like that.
Good.
This is one where subjects are looking at a block that you've got a picture of on the left. And the block has got a normal convex face on it, but it's also got a concave face on it. Now, you won't be able to see this exactly, but when you look at that face on as a subject, you see the thing that you can see on the right. You experience it as if it's a convex face, and that's because our processing has built into it very strong expectations about what faces are going to look like. So even though it's the wrong way around, it's concave, subjects will experience it as a normal convex face. So if you ask people, is the nose in front of the ears? They say, yeah, of course it is. So consciously, you're getting it wrong. There's a conscious illusion. You can see those little dots on the face. Those are little magnets, and you ask subjects to reach and flick off the magnets. And you can analyze the trajectory of their reaching behavior, and you can see that the reach has built into it the knowledge that the stimulus is actually concave. So consciously, there's an illusion we're getting it wrong, but our reaching behavior is immune to that illusion. The reaching behavior driven by unconscious cues is getting it right.
So here we're getting something that appears to the conscious subject, gives them a certain view about where the face is, and it's completely orthogonal to what the behavior does unconsciously. It goes for the depth concave face perfectly. Okay.
Yeah.
So they're proceeding as if independently of one another.
Right. So now we're very much in the realm of the dethroning of consciousness.
Yeah.
Unconscious processes can do intelligent adaptive behavior, and consciousness can get in the way, or it can get it wrong, it can suffer illusions. So that sets up the puzzle. But there's another part of this puzzle, I think a lot of you will be familiar with this, which is a completely different set of results coming out of psychology that are most familiar through Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So the message coming out of that body of results is exactly the opposite. The fast automatic unconscious response often gets it wrong. And you need conscious processing in order to get the right answer. That's what conscious processing is there for, to avoid falling into these simple traps and errors. Now, I know a lot of you will know several of these paradigms, but I want to give you one of these puzzle cases just so I can show you the contrast. So this is a very different kind of case from these reaching cases, right? It's a puzzle about Paul, Linda, and Patrick. And I'm going to ask you, when I've given you all the information, is the answer yes or no, or have I not given you enough information? Is the answer it cannot be determined? Think about it a bit, but give me a relatively automatic, reasonably quick answer. Paul is looking at Linda. Linda is looking at Patrick. Paul is married. Patrick's not married. Is a person who's married looking at a person who's not married? How many people think yes? How many people think no? And how many people think cannot be determined? Okay, great. So I've kind of
good audience.
I've set it up in a difficult way for you. I've asked for a quick response. Let me give you a bit more time and the chance to discuss it with your neighbor. Okay, great. Thanks for all taking part in that so well. Let me just ask again. How many people think yes? How many people think no? And how many think cannot be determined? Okay, so it wasn't a very fair test because I didn't give you very long to discuss it, and I didn't give you very long to think about it in the first place. The reason I'm giving you this one is because in experimental settings, when you put people in little groups of 2 and 3, and they're not having to talk to a new neighbor in a darkened room, people often change their view having discussed it a bit. So I obviously all tempted you into the wrong answer. But it's a kind of paradigm where a lot of people get at the right answer given a bit more discussion time, a bit more than I gave you. If Linda's not married, then Paul's looking at Linda. So someone who's married is looking at someone who's not married. If Linda is married, then she's looking at Patrick. So someone who's married is looking at someone who's not married. So there's a way of laying it out where it's kind of obvious the answer is yes. But it's set up in a way that makes it very difficult to see that.
Didn't get it.
Okay. So you've been a great audience because you've exactly replicated the result we wanted, which is the result you get in the lab when you try people in the lab. It's a difficult problem, but there's something about reasoning and consciousness that's coming in there helping us out with it. Okay, so now we've got a different body of results that's telling us that consciousness is absolutely crucial to getting the right result. And if we go with the fast automatic response, even an audience, a great, well-informed audience of professional people is going to get the wrong answer. You've been brilliant at demonstrating that. There's a question here, which is it? Is it that consciousness is useful for getting it right, or is it that consciousness, as in the earlier experiments, gets in the way and unconscious processing is the thing that gets it wrong?
So it could depend on the task. I mean, you're looking at something in which we're having to react to very fast, pressing left and right. In the other case, there's a sort of reasoning task where there's a lot of information to sift. It's very abstract. You're not actually asked to behaviorally respond. You're asked to think it through. So could it be task-specific? Are we going to divide and rule?
I think that's right. So I think there's different kinds of tasks where you'll find consciousness is useful for some kinds and not useful for others. And in order to get that a bit more clearly, I want to pick up on the other thing you said, which is that the second one is about reasoning. So it's often discussed as the second one being consciousness versus unconscious, but I think actually that's to run together two distinctions. I can see some of you already thinking along those lines. So in the Linda, Patrick, Paul case, I was asking you to come up with a relatively automatic quick answer or to reason about it or talk about it. It wasn't really about anything unconscious. You were conscious of the question, you were conscious of the meaning of the words, you were conscious of the instructions I'd given you, conscious of the answer that you'd given. It's quite unlike the entirely unconscious cases in sport or in the mask illusion, for example. So I think that's a different distinction. That's a distinction between two kinds of processing that can go on, the reasoning one and the automatic one. And that's a different distinction from the one about whether you've got a conscious state that's part of your mental experience. So as we might say, in psychology or in philosophy, the question is whether the representations that are driving behavior are conscious or not. Or more colloquially, are you in a state of consciousness that's driving your behavior, or is it an unconscious state that's driving behavior? So I think if we separate out that question, then we can see that there's a remaining question about what consciousness does, but it's not simply that we shouldn't be run together with the question about what's reasoning good for, and in what circumstances should we do reasoning. So we wanted to focus in on this question, and we had a particular hypothesis about what consciousness is bringing to bear, and this goes back to the experiment I showed you at the beginning.
So I guess this is about whether we can reason unconsciously.
So we'll come to that in a minute, but there's a role of reasoning that's not unconscious reasoning, but that's affecting what you do unconsciously, right? That's what we wanted to probe. So our hypothesis was that conscious processes, although they're not in the driving seat when you're acting quickly in response to some stimuli, in response to a problem, they can change what those fast reactions are like. So think of a cricketer, say. You can walk up to the crease and you can decide, for this over, I'm going to play defensively or I'm going to play in an attacking way. And that's a conscious decision. You probably discussed that with your teammates beforehand. But that decision that you've taken will affect these very fast automatic reactions that you make to the ball after the bowler's released it as it's on the way down. So it's not that consciousness is in the driving seat when you're hitting the ball, but consciousness has somehow played a role in reprogramming those automatic tendencies. And we wanted to probe that too in the project, so we went back to the very simple arrows experiment I showed you earlier, and we ran this with a bunch of members of the public at the Cheltenham Science Festival, so quite a noisy environment. People were coming and asking us about the project, but you can see there in the background, Owen is running a version of the task that you just did at the beginning. But this is a version with a twist. We were telling subjects something about the arrow rather than just presenting them the arrow, and with one group of subjects, we said, you're going to be presented with an arrow, and it's pointing in the direction that the cross is going to turn up. You have to press the cross, and the arrow will help. Although a bit counterintuitive because you don't really see the arrow. With another group of subjects, we said something even more counterintuitive. We said, there's going to be an arrow that you're not going to see, and it's mostly pointing in the wrong direction. Okay, so you think, well, what can I do with that? But actually, we found subjects could do something with that. So it's a bit like the cricket case, playing attackingly or defensively. You can change, kind of on the fly, what your automatic unconscious reactions to these stimuli are. So here, this is the first preview of these results that we just collected a few weeks ago at Cheltenham. They're not yet published. So on the slide, there's a blue dotted line showing when the arrow shows up. And this is masked, so it's not consciously seen. And then the second dotted line is showing when the cross shows up, the thing that you have to move towards. What the lines are showing you are the actual trajectory of people's fingers as they move to touch the screen, to touch the cross on one side or the other. And let's just focus on the red one. The green one's just there for comparison. So the red line shows what happens when the arrow points one way and the cross shows up on the other way. Say the arrow is pointing this side, subjects are beginning to move their finger in the direction that the unconscious arrow is pointing, and then when the cross shows up at the second dotted line, then they adjust and move the right way. So kind of what you'd expect, the arrow is misleading. But here's the interesting contrast. Here's what happened when we told people that the arrows that you're not seeing are going to be mostly pointing the wrong way. And this is the red line again, and you can see there's none of that dip. Subjects aren't starting to move their finger in the wrong direction in response to the arrow. So I can just compare the red lines between the two conditions there. Subjects, although they're looking at the central cross, the eyes are processing the information in the same way. Consciousness has allowed them to reprogram those automatic unconscious tendencies. And I think that's an important thing about what consciousness is doing. Probably not the whole story, but we're beginning to tease out the information processing role that it plays. So let me just pause there to recap where we've got to. So we started with the puzzle. What's consciousness good for? It's been a bit dethroned, but I'm not presupposing that it's not doing anything. And I thought to get clearer about that distinction, we need to make this distinction. And I should mention that this theoretical work with Chris Frith, the neuroscientist, was absolutely key to making this two-way distinction. So let me just show you that two-way distinction a bit more explicitly. So I said this other literature, like the Kahneman tasks, that are sometimes said to be about consciousness being useful for getting the right result, are actually about a different thing. They're about automatic processing versus deliberate processing. And then we've got another distinction between the conscious and the non-conscious. So I showed you the case where a non-conscious arrow can help you perform a task. That's the first box, the non-conscious automatic. And then I gave you the Patrick, Linda, and Paul problem, and you can see that in both cases you're fully conscious of what's going on, but there's a difference between the automatic answer and the reasoned one, the one you got to when I showed you why there's a good answer. An interesting thing that comes out of this is the question whether there's anything in this box. It's kind of almost doesn't make sense, but it's a good empirical question. Are there ever cases where something that looks like a deliberate reasoning process, say doing a mathematical problem, can be done entirely unconsciously? And some people say, well, I sometimes solve problems in my sleep. Right? If there was evidence for that, then that would be a case, although the evidence for that is pretty equivocal. So having set things up this way, I then said, well, then we can home in a bit more on what this distinction's doing. And I gave you a little bit of evidence that one of the important things it's doing is that once you're conscious, you can change what goes on in this box. You can change your automatic unconscious tendencies. Consciousness is on this long time scale, but it can change the very short time scale decision making as it works.
So that's very interesting, and I think it would be helpful if you said something about what we mean by automatic, because that's not a straightforward notion.
And that's something that's addressed in the literature, so you've got the kind of everyday idea that in some cases you're reasoning through problems in a serial way, in other cases they're just happening. The way it's mostly probed in the psychological literature is the way that I showed you in that golfer case where he's listening to something. So the question is, can you do two different tasks at once in parallel without them interfering with each other? If so, they're both automatic. So the golfer could hit a good ball and at the same time listen out for an unusual tone in his or her ears. Deliberate processes are unlike that. They interfere with each other. So if I asked you to listen out for an unusual tone and at the same time do some mental arithmetic, they'd mess each other up. Listening for the tone would mess up the mental arithmetic and vice versa. So that's the principal way at getting at this distinction.
Because that's, I think, quite important. I mean, I think a lot of people probably here will have ideas of what automatic means, can't have any control over it. And of course, what you're now saying is something really quite interesting, which is if you've consciously, deliberately set, in some sense you can't control it when it's set off and running, but you can program it. So the control issue isn't maybe quite the right way to define it, nor is it just about timing. Not just about timing. Presumably you can do things deliberately and very fast.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's much more to be said and indeed investigated about how to draw this distinction, and I think the relation with control is a key one, because it's not really known how this idea that we're in control, we're in the driving seat, relates to consciousness. Although if it turns out that deliberate reasoning here requires consciousness, then we will see that there is a quite tight connection, that consciousness is partly there in order to allow us to do the deliberate reasoning, which is the seat of our kind of cognitive control or self-control. Okay, so I've given you a hypothesis about what consciousness is doing and a bit of evidence for it. So consciousness is there because it allows us to reprogram these automatic non-conscious tendencies. But I'm sure that's not the full story. And another thing that we did in Cheltenham is we asked people, as they were waiting to do the experiment or watching people do the experiment, we asked people, what do you think consciousness is for? You know, this is an area where science doesn't have a settled answer. We're really interested in the hypothesis we should be testing. And we got a range of different things coming up. Some of the answers that our participants and other people came up with are here. So one relates to this thing about decision making, and it suggests that consciousness is there for making decisions. It's not that all kinds of control requires consciousness, but there's automatic decisions and then there's the ones that we really make. And so that relates to this idea that there's nothing in this box, so consciousness is needed for making these kinds of decisions. But then I wanted to highlight these other two, because it gives us a slightly different picture about what consciousness is for. And it's interesting for me that people come up with this spontaneously. So one person said, well, it's to allow me to create and learn and connect with other people. Another person said, well, I need it to teach people. So there's the learning from others and the teaching from others. And this goes back to the Patrick, Linda, and Paul problem that I tricked you all with. But the evidence is that in that case, when people do it deliberatively and consciously with each other, they're much more likely to get to the right answer. So I think that gives us a hint that the people who are coming up with these ideas about teaching and learning are onto something, that consciousness is really central to the way that we can perform tasks together, to the social role of consciousness. And of course, humans are a supremely social species. We've evolved to do things in very cooperative ways. So that gives us a kind of interesting reversal of the way that we think about consciousness. Because if consciousness has having its central role in the social case, then consciousness isn't the home of privacy, as it's sometimes been thought to be in philosophy. So there is an everyday intuitive idea that consciousness is this private thing that we have ourselves, it's hard to communicate to others, it's going on within us. But I think these suggestions and other lines of evidence suggest it might be just the other way around. Consciousness might be there for, or one of the things that it's centrally there for, is to allow us to talk about our internal states, to discuss them with others in the context of solving tasks together, joint decision making, and cooperating.